Typically, most playable characters in video games are made to be good at what they do. In single-player games, they could be designed to fill an in-game role, such as being a beginner-friendly tutorial character, and in multiplayer games, they could be designed with a competitive metagame in mind, and attempt to stay more or less balanced relative to one another. Then there's these guys. The joke character is an odd anomaly of game design which actively contradicts conventional game design logic. Ordinarily, there is a proven positive correlation between a character's popularity and their general in-game competency. Characters which are mechanically powerful, possess conventionally attractive or cool designs, or are rare and exclusive to acquire are statistically more likely to be popular among fans compared to characters who are weaker, have weird designs, and are more common to find. The joke character takes this statistical correlation and snaps it in half. These are characters who are designed with severe gameplay flaws, possess strange and unusual mechanics, and either have unconventional appearances or don't exactly fit in with other characters in the game. Yet despite their severe inadequacies, they are loved and adored by many fans within those game communities, precisely for those exact same inadequacies. Why is that? Well, the reason can be summed up in 2 words. Because funny. Ultimately, the goal of a game character is to create a positive player experience. The joke character makes you laugh, ergo creating a positive experience. Of course, there's a lot more nuance to this. Joke characters also fulfill a few other unusual secondary functions within their respective games. They can act as a form of self-handicap, forcing a player to use a terrible character to give their opponent a chance. They can be used as a form of mockery, being used to defeat their opponent in a humiliating and embarrassing fashion. They could have strange and unusual mechanics and gimmicks, adding more playstyle variety to the cast. They could act as an optional or unlockable challenge mode, allowing a player to experience the game under changed or new limitations. They could help change the tone of a game, helping add some lighthearted flair to reduce the overall seriousness and tension. I cannot stress enough how beneficial some of these secondary functions can be for an overall game. Being called a joke character is not an insult. So that's our topic of discussion for today. What goes into creating a joke character? Firstly, let's make sure we are all on the same page, because the term joke character means different things to different people. A joke character is best defined by the following phrase.
We have purposely trained him wrong, as a joke.
If you've got an ass, I'll kick it!
Break this down into 3 parts. Number 1, purposely. That means this is the core design intent of the character. You don't get points for accidentally achieving comedy. Number 2, trained him wrong. The character has a noticeable gameplay flaw which can result in questionable performance. Number 3, as a joke. Something about the character's gameplay serves as the punchline for the joke. This is an important distinction to make because any character's gameplay can be made funny in the hands of a sufficiently creative player. The joke character transcends the concept of just being funny. That isn't enough. The very core foundation behind this character's entire creation has to be a joke. In other words, the joke and gameplay are inextricably linked through intended design and form an essential part of the character's core identity. You cannot separate them from each other. Here's a few examples of non-joke characters to explain. In Marvel Rivals, Reed Richards takes a page out of One Piece, as his rubber powers are portrayed in a fantastically cartoonish fashion with incredibly funny voice lines. There's a lot of great jokes, and this is probably one of my favorite portrayals of the character in any media. But here's the thing. Mr. Fantastic doesn't play like a joke. His abilities are visually silly, but are all totally practical and effective for his intended hybrid tank/DPS playstyle. He only ticks 2 of the boxes, as his mechanics were purposely created with funny joke elements, but none of those mechanics were flawed in any way, and he clearly functions like a normal character. In a similar vein, we have Deadpool in Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Despite being the Marvel franchise's undisputed king of comedy and making lots of good jokes, Deadpool functions like a bog standard character, and his gag elements are portrayed in ways which don't involve gameplay mechanics whatsoever, such as his taunt or cinematic cutscene level 3 super. Next, we have Rainbow Six Siege's Tachanka.
LMG! Mounted and loaded!
His original unique mechanic let him set up a stationary LMG, with the intent being to establish a fortified defensive position. This ended up being almost useless in practice because the game's design heavily emphasized mobility, recon, and flanking, which made his stationary turret into an actual liability, especially because the machine gun had a limited angle of rotation and the opposing team could also hijack it if they killed him. Not that they'd ever want to, because the gun sucked. Due to a combination of various community shenanigans and his extreme Russianness, Lord Tachanka's uselessness became the subject of much ironic humor within the context of the game, and eventually led to him becoming the franchise's resident meme king and arguably most recognizable character, partially helped thanks to his incredibly distinctive helmet making him stick out like a sore thumb from the crowd of otherwise forgettable special ops outfits. In other words, he got built wrong and became a joke. However, what ultimately disqualifies Tachanka as a joke character is that he was not purposely made to be a joke. In fact, the developers actually wanted him to be a viable character, and admitted in an interview that they spent a long time deliberating on how to buff him or even if they should buff him because so many players actively enjoyed the joke of him being awful. Eventually, years after the game's initial release, Tachanka was completely reworked and received a whole new set of mechanics, basically requiring the same amount of development effort as making a whole new character, subsequently removing the second checked box on our list. The main takeaway here is that Lord Tachanka was not a planned joke, but a failure in game design, and his popularity among fans was due to a series of fortunate events rather than being an intentional outcome. Lastly, well, let's pick a Pokemon, shall we? How about Sunflora? Sunflora is a Pokemon purposely designed to be awful because it was originally balanced around the third gym of the Johto games. Due to being a sequel, Gold and Silver wanted to showcase a new assortment of evolution items and mechanics, and one of these is the Sunstone. This was prominently advertised in-game as the top prize of the bug catching contest minigame, and was portrayed as a valuable item worth the player's efforts to acquire. However, an evolution stone would be worthless without a Pokemon to evolve, so they needed to provide a Pokemon to use it on, which they did. Oddish and Sunkern were both obtainable by that point. Ordinarily, most stone evolutions are balanced around the evolution stones being rare items, which are only obtainable in limited quantities at mid to late stage points of their games, which means these evolutions are balanced around the points where those stones are obtainable. This handicaps Sunflora because both Sunkern and the Sunstone are obtained in the same location, so the developers balanced Sunflora around that exact point of the game, before the third gym. This is why Sunflora sucks. It is the only stone evolution intentionally designed as an early game Pokemon because you can obtain one at level 13, making it statistically comparable to other early game Pokemon such as Noctowl or Pidgeotto in terms of usefulness. Instead of Sunkern being a usable base Pokemon which then evolves into a more powerful state, they are balanced as though Sunflora was the base Pokemon and Sunkern is a baby. However, despite their abysmal performance, Sunflora is not a joke character because there is no joke involved. It was purposely trained wrong, but for reasons which have nothing to do with humor. 2 out of 3 boxes. So now you understand what defines a joke character and what makes a character not a joke character. In which case, 次にお前はジョークキャラクターを作成するにはどうすればいいですかという。Well, hypothetically, it's quite straightforward. Step 1, come up with a joke. Step 2, create all of your character's mechanics around that joke. Step 3, ensure the character's gameplay is somehow obviously flawed to emphasize the joke. Basically, you come up with a really funny joke and go out of your way to build everything about the character to reflect that funny idea as much as possible, including subverting the game's core balance and creating strange gimmick mechanics to do so. Note that the joke doesn't always have to be well received. Humor and comedy are subjective after all, and it isn't always possible to predict audience reception. Street Fighter Cross Tekken's Mega Man is a tragic example of this. He was a parody of the bad box arts from the original Mega Man games, and his projectiles functioned as incompetently as he looks. He was a genuinely funny joke with the absolute worst timing in the world, because he released at the peak of frustration regarding Capcom's neglectful treatment of the Mega Man franchise. Truly a shame. Anyways, if you do it right, you'll end up with a very funny gimmick character. That character character must then be nerfed in ways which don't compromise that funny gimmick. This might seem cruel, but it is a necessary safeguard to ensure the character doesn't end up breaking the game's balance in some way, because gimmick mechanics tend to lead to unpredictable outcomes when in the hands of creative players. Ideally, you want the game's balance and metagame to reflect the majority of the playable roster's actual performance. It would be grossly unfair to every other character if the one joke character somehow outperforms everyone else because of an unintended game mechanic interaction. Remember, joke characters are anomalies to the standards of a game's balance. They should never be reflective of the game's balance. Seems straightforward enough. As long as you have a good sense of humor and are cautious with your balancing, a joke character should be easy to make. I mean, you don't even need to make them viable or good, so why don't more games have them? See, here's the thing. In practice, developing the joke character is not the actually difficult part about creating the joke character. The actually difficult part is you getting the money and approval to make the joke character. The question which you, as a creator, need to answer is not, is this joke funny? The question needed to be answered is this joke funny enough to be worth the development costs needed to make it? At the end of the day, produced media like games and movies are equal parts art and product. Everything about the creative process involves a cost to produce, meaning producers have a limited budget which they need to spend carefully, and they might not be so keen to spend it on making a joke character. In my previous year's April Fool's video, this was the key takeaway and reason behind the stupid Final Fantasy staircase gag's existence. It was a genuinely funny sequence which lasted for several minutes of playtime and was something most players could identify was an intentional joke, yet cost almost nothing to create, making it a great return on investment. However, the joke character does not have the same low production cost to justify just throwing it in. Quite the opposite, in fact. Producing an entire playable character potentially entails a very high development cost. Depending on the game and the character's complexity, this could be one of the more expensive tasks the project could undertake. And that's just the immediate cost. If the game is in live service or gets a sequel, then that joke needs to be carried forward and actively supported with development resources for the long term. Is it really worth committing all these resources just to create a joke instead of using them to improve some other part of the game? Is there any way to make that same joke without needing to dedicate an entire character to it? Can't we just make a regular character but give them some funny voice lines or animations instead? Will players even be willing to play or pay money for a character like this? Could we either make a better player experience or earn more money if we made a regular character? These are the kinds of questions a designer might expect to face if they propose creating a joke character. It's all fun and games until upper management gets involved and someone has to explain the bill. Remember, development costs aren't just numbers listed on paper. They consist of resources, time, developer hours, art, and so on, all of which could have potentially been used to make something else in the game which contributes more to the average player experience. Every joke character that was ever created needed to justify how they are worth that opportunity cost to develop. And that has become increasingly more difficult to justify as time passed, because development costs have progressively increased over time. This is why joke characters are such a rarity in the modern day. Fortunately for us, many developers have successfully found ways to justify these opportunity costs. The first justification is to reduce the development cost. Get it low enough and it will just get waved through. The joke character can be cobbled together by remixing existing assets from elsewhere in the game, allowing you to technically create a new character for cheap and therefore improve the return on development cost. This is why some joke characters in certain games are palette swaps. The second justification is to have the character be created for some other purpose and have the joke be a secondary element. Usually that purpose is marketing. This is very important in the modern era which we live in, because viral marketing is a powerful force, and weird, wacky, and funny stuff has much greater potential to go viral, attracting attention towards your game. Look at Neko Arc, for example. There are people who have seen Neko Arc but have never heard of Melty Blood or Tsukihime. Heck, it is entirely possible that more people are more familiar with Neko Arc than the character she's based on. No offense to the Ashes fans out there, the funny cat is just more memeable. And as we all know, memes are the DNA of the soul. There's a good number of people who only know about this game's existence through Neko Arc. Despite not being very good within the game itself, the sheer absurdity of this character allowed it to transcend its own niche, very Japanese game and enter the wider international mainstream. If the joke character is able to generate substantial viral marketing through comedy and positive reception, they can be worth the production cost. This is likely what motivated Jeff the Land Shark being made for Marvel Rivals. He's a minor side character related to Gwenpool, the other joke character among the Marvel franchise, so he's not a conventional pick choice for a cast full of A-list superheroes. In-game, well, he's not exactly incompetent, but he's not exactly good either. He's a solid healer, but not an amazing one, because every healer in this game also provides additional utilities to the team, and Jeff offers very little utility beyond a simple speed buff. He's got good personal mobility, but his health is fairly low and his hitbox is massive, meaning he dies very easily even by healer standards. He's also not exactly good at fighting, which would ordinarily be expected of a healer, except other healers in this game can actually fight, so Jeff is an unfortunate exception. His actual funny joke mechanic lies in his ultimate. Jeff swallows everyone in the AoE, both enemies and allies, damaging and healing them respectively. Jeff can then either spit them out separately, or he could kill himself. Now! Yes, he could spit the enemies off the cliff, but many characters have mobility skills and can return to the stage Smash Bros. Style, and some map elements could interfere with your spit angle. So sometimes jumping off the cliff and taking everyone down with him is the better option. This does mean he can technically team kill very reliably if you are careless or want to troll. So Jeff is overall functional, but not exactly good and can be kinda questionably practical, especially if the map doesn't have a convenient cliff to throw people off, as a joke character should be. However, Jeff's in-game performance is unimportant because he's also an adorable shark puppy and makes for a fantastic mascot. Seriously, look at how much of the game's marketing features this guy. On a side note, this is also why Delibird exists. Gotta get that Christmas marketing revenue, am I right? Of course, there are other non-sales related applications. The joke character could be used to show off a new feature or serve some other function elsewhere in the game. Several Pokemon do this. Chatot exists to show off the DS's microphone, and Love This exists as a Meadow Slime for Heart Scale. Binding of Isaac's joke characters serve as unlockable challenge modes for the overall game, as their abysmal abilities serve to change the way a player approaches a game and manages their resources. In Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn, Oliver serves the role of being the level's boss and major arc villain, who will forcibly join your party without your consent if his secret recruitment condition is met. While Oliver's stats as a playable unit are laughable, Fire Emblem's game mechanics means you can still use him in battle if you want to, and you get a lot of funny dialogue if you do so. Really though, his actual in-game function as a unit is that recruiting him acts as a skip to his boss fight. The third justification is to sell DLC, making the joke character pay for itself. This usually takes the form of cosmetics and microtransactions for the existing character, which add to the joke somehow. In rare occasions, the entire character themselves might be directly added and sold as standalone DLC or part of a season pass. However, this is only possible if the character is someone who is popular enough to really guarantee the sale, like a guest character, a returning character from a past game, or a really popular NPC. If they are someone totally new, it might not be worth the risk. Take Smash Brothers for instance. My dear viewers, confess your sins and answer me right now in the comments. How many of you paid for Minecraft Steve? How many of you paid for the Sans Undertale costume? How many of you would unironically pay for a hypothetical playable Waluigi purely for the meme? Don't lie to me, you people exist. I know you do. The fourth justification is the one most frequently seen in modern times. It's to make the joke character an actual viable character. The character's conventional performance is awful, but due to how their gameplay mechanics function, the character can achieve surprising results if you play in unusual ways which fully take advantage of said mechanics. This is different from the earlier examples of Reed Richards and Deadpool because those characters have genuinely fantastic gameplay performance and can be played like a normal character. These types of joke characters characters are legitimately awful if you play them normally, and require an unorthodox approach to properly use. These characters sidestep the production cost problem because they don't exist solely to be a joke. They can still produce results just as good as regular characters, meaning they can function as alternative playstyles to provide more gameplay diversity. Jigglypuff in Smash Bros. Is a good example of this. Weak normal attacks, lightweight, and up special with no offstage recovery, instantly flies upwards to an off-screen KO if its tiny shield gets broken, and multiple specials which either make the user stationary or visually appear seemingly useless at first glance. However, the joke is that Rest has a tiny hitbox which deals obscene amounts of damage and KOs at comically low percentages. A good Jigglypuff player needs to forego the ground-based combat of most other fighters, get used to constantly floating around and using aerial attacks, and get good at connecting with Rest. If they do figure this out, they can be a true menace. Guilty Gear's Robo-Kai possesses an arsenal of moves with goofy animations and strange properties, but what defines his performance are his electricity and heat gauges. Instead of a standard tension gauge like all the other characters, Robo-Kai must balance two separate meters which only build up or decrease if certain specific moves are used. The amount of charge in each gauge affects the damage output of different moves. If they are too low, Robo-Kai deals pathetic damage, but if the heat gauge maxes out, he instantly explodes, interrupting his combo, dealing self-damage, and resetting the gauges. Any player who attempts to play Robo-Kai like a normal character will typically either do abysmal damage or self-destruct very quickly. However, a player who actually gets good at managing both gauges properly is capable of outputting some remarkable offensive pressure, until he explodes, that is. Really curious to see how they handle this guy if he comes to Strive. Hopefully next year. I believe in Daisuke's vision. There is also the final solution, which is to exert full creative control. This happens in the rare cases where the game's director has so much power, they don't need to justify their decisions to anybody and can just do whatever the heck they want. Smash Bros. Is a perfect example of that. Very few things are able to stop Sakurai from doing what he wants, because the game provides so many benefits to Nintendo that he is afforded a huge amount of power and budget. If the man decides he wants to make a playable Piranha Plant, well, who's going to stop him?
What?
What the
What? What?
fuck it!
What?
If a developer can design their joke character with some of the above justifications in mind, they'll have a much higher chance of getting their design proposal actually approved by production and management, and not be thrown away and dismissed as a waste of resources. And of course, no character showcases all of this better than the definitive joke character, the man, the myth, the legend, master of the strongest style, Dan Hibiki. Because Dan owes his continued existence to not just one justification, but all of them. Dan originates from Street Fighter Alpha, and he was originally created as a joke parody of rival company SNK's Art of Fighting by basically combining the sprites of their two protagonists. Robert Garcia's head slapped onto a pink recolor of Ryo Sakazaki's body. His original moveset was also laughably slapped together using existing assets, reusing much of Ryu and Ken's existing moveset except his version being far more rubbish. His Gadoken, notably, is a tiny scaled down version of the standard Hadoken sprite with no travel distance. This all results in him having a comparatively lower cost of production than most characters, because his sprites being direct copies likely resulted in a relatively short concept and design phase compared to a totally new character like Charlie Nash. In other words, he was cheap to make. Check the first box. Dan's character would gradually evolve with every subsequent game he appeared in, and over time, he developed an identity beyond just being an Art of Fighting parody. His character design changed, trading out the original Art of Fighting sprites for a unique face and outfit. He picked up an assortment of new moves, many of which now differed from Ryu and Ken. His story, personality, goals, motivation, and daily life were expanded upon and explored. He formed friendships and connections with other characters, like Sakura and Blanca. He was now a fully fledged member of the Street Fighter cast, and had fans who appreciated both his comical playstyle and him as a character. Yes, Dan was still a joke, but he was now so much more than that. He was now a joke on his own terms. His identity was no longer tied to being a parody of two different characters from a different game. In his own strange way, Dan had become his own man and was in charge of his own destiny. By the time of Street Fighter IV, Dan's popularity had grown to the point that he was even included in the base roster of the vanilla game's home console release, meaning he was given the second level of priority after the initial arcade release. To put that into perspective, Dan Hibiki, the joke character, was included in the same batch of characters as Cammy, Sakura, and Akuma. In other words, Dan had become a selling point in his own right, whose presence helped sell people on the game. He wasn't the strongest selling point, mind you, but he still was one. Let me restate that. The joke character was a selling point. Check the second box. When Street Fighter V rolled around, Dan slowly emerged as a recurring request after most of the series' staple options like Guile, Sagat, Blanca, Akuma, and Honda got added in season passes. Can you believe they seriously launched Street Fighter V without Guile? Dan eventually got added and brought along a new twist to his joke character status. In this game, all characters have a set of special moves called V-skills, which typically provide unique mechanics, buff other moves, or act as a set of extra attacks. Dan's V-skills were a set of taunts, which dealt nearly zero damage. In fact, these taunts can potentially punish a player for using them because they charge the V-gauge of both Dan and his opponent. However, these taunts have a funny property. They can be used to cancel certain normal or special moves, and can in turn be cancelled into other normal and special moves. This gave Dan the undisputed greatest amount of combo flexibility out of all characters in the game. Good Dan players basically acted as if frame data didn't exist, and could weave bizarrely long combos filled with non-stop taunts and attacks, whereas bad Dan players would miss the input timing, get stuck in the taunt animation, and get punched in the face for their efforts. I unironically mained this guy, and this wacky taunt combo playstyle was a ton of fun. I also got punched in the face a lot for my efforts, so I am self-admitting that I am not good at fighting games. Anyways, this taunt cancel mechanic, when mastered, was so good, Dan could execute an infinite combo. To mitigate this, the developers gave his Gadoken a chance to randomly deal extra damage and knock down the opponent, ending the combo but giving the Dan player an opportunity to start a new one. It also made the Gadoken better for all other situations. That's right, they managed to nerf Dan by buffing him. Somehow. Oh yeah, Dan could also spend his entire meter to perform a super taunt. This does no damage and actually maxes out both players' super meters. During the ending portion of this taunt, Dan takes 5 times the amount of damage. If an opponent hits him with a critical art during this time, Dan instantly dies. This move is completely useless, but magnificently so. It truly elevates the phrase "taunt to get bodied" into an art form. In other words, Dan's assorted new gameplay mechanics allowed him to retain his identity as an ineffectual joke character, but provided the potential for impressive results if a player manages to figure them out. In other words, he's an actually viable character. Check the fourth box. In fact, Capcom held so much faith in this incarnation of Dan, he was made the headline character of the game's 5th and final season pass. And indeed, he sold. Many Street Fighter players happily bought the pass, though it did help that Capcom had significantly improved the game's overall live service by this point. And with Street Fighter 6 now released, you'd best believe there's a host of fans waiting to pay money for Dan once again. Check the third box. And lastly, we cannot forget how all of this tomfoolery began purely because the developers on Street Fighter Alpha wanted to indulge in a bit of good-natured friendly trolling of their rival competitors at SNK. SNK, to their credit, took the joke fairly well and indulged in some of their own trolling in return. When both companies came together to create the Capcom vs SNK crossover series, Dan Hibiki would be selected as one of Street Fighter's representatives over traditional options like Cammy or Zangief, and many jokes were made at his expense. He gained new moves which parodied the art of fighting even more. Almost every character gets to insult him, and one of his supers causes him to explode and lose all his HP. In other words, Dan owes his existence to creative control. The developers at both Capcom and SNK pushed hard for this joke because they really just wanted to make the joke, and we should properly appreciate that. Check the final box. Truly, Dan is the undisputed king of joke characters, a true master of the art of comedy. There will never be another character like him, for Dan is simply the strongest. So what did we learn from all this? Well, we learned that a joke character is a fairly specific form of humor. We learned that creating one can be far more resource intensive than it seems, and that a lot of hoops needed to be jumped through to make it happen. We examined a huge number of characters, explaining why they are and are not joke characters based on their mechanics or developer intent. We also glazed Dan Hibiki a lot. Did any of this give you any actual useful insight into the game development process? Probably not. At the end of the day, joke characters are a luxury, one which smaller scale developers with lower budgets should not afford because they can take up valuable resources which would be better spent elsewhere. They might provide a number of useful secondary benefits or serve alternative roles, but they are never an essential part of any game, nor are they the most useful things to make. But they are a fun novelty which makes us smile, and there is value in that. So we should show these jokes the proper appreciation they deserve. So my viewer, tell me, what is your favorite joke character in any video game, and why do you appreciate them? And if you appreciate this video, then leave a comment and a like so that the algorithm thinks I actually make good content. I really appreciate it.